In the winter of 1821, a child no older than 10 stood before a gathering of doctors and priests, his eyes distant, his voice steady. What emerged from his lips was not madness, not mimicry, but a language no human being had ever heard. It carried no trace of any culture, no resemblance to any scripture or dialect known to man. Yet, every person who heard him felt something ancient stir within, a tremor of recognition, as though the boy had not invented a language, but awakened one that humanity had forgotten. The phenomenon of a child speaking a language that defied all known classification is more than an anomaly of linguistics. It is a wound torn open in the fabric of rational understanding. In 1821, when the boy was first recorded uttering those sounds no scholar could trace, the world was forced to pause and listen to something older than civilization itself. This event was not merely historical. It was symbolic, an eruption from the depths of human consciousness that could not be measured by the instruments of science. The boy's voice, in its incomprehensible rhythm, hinted that there are layers of knowledge that do not belong to learning or memory, but to something innate, something remembered by the soul rather than taught by the world. His words emerged like echoes of an origin long forgotten, as though he were reciting the dream of humanity before the first words were ever spoken. If language is the bridge between mind and reality, then this unknown speech represented a bridge to something beyond the mind itself. Listeners described how his words carried an unexplainable emotional weight, as if each syllable vibrated with meaning that reason could not grasp, but the heart could feel. Scholars transcribed the sounds, trying to find patterns in their structure, but what they found was not a system of grammar. It was a pulse, a rhythm, a resonance that seemed to belong to life itself. The boy did not learn to speak. He remembered how to speak, as if drawing from a deep, universal memory where the boundaries of culture and history no longer existed. This raised questions far beyond the boy's case. Could it be that all human beings carry, hidden within their unconscious, fragments of a primal tongue that once connected them before the world was divided by nations and time? The mystery was not simply linguistic, it was existential. If the boy's speech came from no teacher and no book, then it must have come from within him, or beyond him, perhaps both. This realization terrified those who studied him, because it implied that knowledge and expression are not entirely products of external experience. It suggested that buried within the psyche lies a reservoir of ancestral memory, a collective inheritance of the human spirit that occasionally breaks through the surface of ordinary life. His language, then, was not a new creation, but a revelation of something eternally present, but mostly unseen. When he spoke, it was as if an ancient voice had borrowed the lips of a child to remind the modern world of its forgotten origin. Witnesses described strange effects when he spoke. Some claimed to feel a sudden calm, others an inexplicable sadness. A few even said they dreamed in the same rhythm after hearing him, as though the sound had awakened a slumbering chord within their minds. These reactions revealed that meaning does not only exist in logic or translation, but also in the invisible correspondence between symbol and soul. The boy's voice bypassed understanding and touched something far deeper, something that recognized itself in the sound, though it could not explain why. It was the same kind of recognition one feels in dreams, when an image or word feels utterly familiar, though it has never been seen before. The boy's speech became a doorway into that mystery, the strange knowing that lives within all of us but rarely speaks. Those who tried to study him scientifically found themselves confronted with the limits of reason. They discovered that the human mind, though capable of brilliance, is not the final authority on truth. The boy's case suggested that perhaps truth itself speaks in many tongues and that one of them belongs to the unconscious. In that sense, the unknown language was not meaningless. It was meaning in its purest form, untranslated, unshaped, uncontained. It was the language of being itself, before words were caged by grammar and reason. It reminded humanity that understanding is not the same as knowing, and that some of the most profound truths are not discovered through intellect, but through the deep resonance of the soul, recognizing its own echo in the mystery of existence. The era in which the boy appeared was one intoxicated with reason. The early 19th century stood proudly beneath the banner of progress, where every mystery was believed to be merely a question awaiting the light of human intellect. Science was gaining confidence, philosophy was being polished by logic, and faith was being redefined through moral order rather than wonder. It was a time when the mind was worshipped, and everything irrational was dismissed as primitive residue. Yet into this carefully ordered world entered a child who spoke in a language that none could decipher. His presence was an affront to the pride of the rational age, a living paradox that mocked the boundaries of understanding. The boy's words carried no translation, no etymology, no cultural root. They were simply there, irreducible and undeniable. His speech acted as a mirror, reflecting the shadows of the human mind that reason had long tried to silence. Those who heard him described the experience as unsettling, not merely because they couldn't understand him, but because they felt they almost could. There was a rhythm to his tone, an inflection that hinted at meaning beyond sound. Listeners sometimes found themselves emotionally affected, as if the words had reached them in a place that language was never meant to touch. This disturbed the men of intellect, for it implied that comprehension was not confined to reason alone. The boy's speech awakened the part of the human spirit that modernity had buried, the ancient instinct that senses meaning not through analysis, but through intuition and feeling. Rational society feared this because it revealed the limits of its own constructs. The more scholars tried to explain him, the more they realized that his existence was an intrusion from a dimension they could not define, a region of the mind that defied the rules of reason. In their attempts to study him, doctors noted that his pulse remained calm even when he was surrounded by scrutiny, as if he were untouched by the anxiety of the world around him. He did not stutter, he did not seem confused. He spoke his impossible language with clarity, with serenity, as if he were communicating something entirely natural. To him, the world of the unknown was not strange, it was home. It was the observers who trembled, not the boy. And in that reversal, an unspoken truth emerged. It was not he who was insane, but perhaps the society that had forgotten how to listen. His voice forced the rational world to confront its own fragility. The walls of certainty cracked, revealing the vast ocean of the irrational that lies beneath all human logic. Those who studied him often argued whether the phenomenon was divine or pathological. Some priests claimed he was a vessel of spirits, a messenger from beyond. Scientists called him delusional, a case of linguistic hallucination. Yet in both interpretations, the same fear pulsed beneath the surface, the fear of what the human mind hides from itself. The rational order of the world depends on boundaries, on labeling and classifying every experience into something manageable. But the boy could not be categorized. His speech belonged to no pattern, his mind to no theory. He stood as a reminder that reason itself is only a thin veil stretched over something vast, dark, and powerful. Behind that veil lives the shadow, the repressed side of consciousness that modern thought tries to ignore. The boy's language, therefore, was more than sound. It was the voice of the shadow, breaking through centuries of repression. Each syllable was an echo of the irrational, the mystical, the forgotten dimensions of human existence. To those who feared the unknown, it was madness. To those who listened with the soul, it was revelation. He embodied the confrontation every human must face, the moment when the intellect is forced to meet its own limits and admit that truth is not always logical. The boy was a living symbol of that collision, a reminder that the rational mind, no matter how enlightened, always casts a shadow behind it. And sometimes, when the world grows too proud of its reason, the shadow speaks. To those who witnessed the boy, his language seemed to flow from a source untouched by confusion or hesitation. He spoke with the calm certainty of one who was not inventing but remembering. This was what disturbed the observers most, that his words did not seem like the product of imagination or delusion, but of recollection. He spoke as though the unknown language had always belonged to him, as though he had simply carried it across the threshold of birth. The idea that a child could remember something he had never been taught unsettled even the most rational minds. It hinted at the existence of a realm beyond conscious experience, a place where knowledge is not learned but known. Perhaps his language was not external at all. Perhaps it was the articulation of the inner world, the psychic landscape that lies beneath thought, where images, instincts, and symbols form the ancient architecture of the soul. Every human being carries within them an unseen continent of memory, one that predates personal experience. It manifests in dreams, in symbols, in inexplicable feelings that have no apparent cause. This inner archive, inherited and eternal, does not speak in the vocabulary of modern tongues. It speaks in the language of the unconscious, a language made of rhythm, sound, and emotion. When the boy spoke, his words seemed to emerge from this invisible ocean. He was not creating meaning through grammar. He was channeling meaning through presence. His speech seemed to communicate directly to the emotional core of those around him. Witnesses described how his voice resonated with a strange harmony that made them feel both comforted and unsettled, as if he was giving voice to something that existed within them but had long been silent. The boundaries between inner and outer reality blurred in his presence. His speech became a living proof that the mind and the world are not separate, but reflections of one another. To most, the idea that the inner world could be as real as the outer one was heresy. The scientific spirit of the time demanded evidence, and the spiritual authorities demanded doctrine. The boy offered neither. He simply existed as an embodiment of mystery, a reminder that the greatest truths are not always measurable. His language was not a code to be broken, but a revelation to be experienced. It invited the listener to step inward, to face the landscapes of their own psyche. For when the boy spoke, he was not merely communicating, he was awakening. Those who heard him described visions, dreams, or sudden insights afterward, as though his voice had unlocked something dormant within them. He became a living bridge between the conscious and the unconscious, between the rational and the symbolic. In him, the two realms converged. His behavior reinforced this impression. He would often fall silent for long periods, his eyes unfocused, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, suddenly, the unknown words would spill out in a cadence that resembled neither chant nor speech. It was as though he was translating an invisible current that flowed through him. Some believed he was hearing the voice of God, others thought he was recalling a forgotten civilization. But perhaps he was giving expression to the deepest layer of human experience, where thought, dream, and instinct are one. The boy's gift, if it can be called that, was not in producing meaning, but in revealing that meaning already exists within. He made visible the truth that the human soul contains its own universe, and that the outer world is only its reflection. His case became a mirror for those who observed him. Scholars and priests alike projected their fears and desires upon him, trying to make sense of what he represented. Yet he remained untouched by their interpretations. His calmness, his lack of interest in their explanations, suggested that he operated in a dimension where such distinctions, real or unreal, sacred or profane, rational or mad, did not exist. The boy spoke from a state of being where opposites dissolve, where words and silence share the same meaning. His mysterious language was not meant to be deciphered. It was meant to remind humanity of what it had forgotten, that the inner world is not a dream, but a dimension of reality as vast and ancient as the cosmos itself. Through him, the unseen found a voice, and for a brief moment, the veil between the two worlds became thin enough for all to glimpse what lies beyond understanding. If the human race shares a common body, then it may also share a common memory, an unbroken thread of inner experience that stretches across generations and civilizations. This shared inheritance does not record events or language in the way that history does. It preserves feelings, images, and archetypal meanings that belong to all humanity. The case of the boy in 1821, whose speech could not be traced to any known language, offered a haunting suggestion of this collective memory resurfacing through a single voice. When he spoke, people from vastly different backgrounds reacted with similar emotions, some trembling in awe, others weeping uncontrollably, and still others feeling an inexplicable peace. The sound of his words bypassed intellect entirely, reaching a place within the listener that existed before education or culture. It was as though he had discovered a universal key capable of unlocking something ancient and buried in every soul. Scholars tried to analyze the linguistic structure of his speech, but what they were hearing was not meant for the rational mind. It was meant for the deep reservoir of shared human consciousness that operates beneath thought. The reactions of those who listened reveal something profound about human nature. Although no one understood his words, nearly everyone felt their significance. The boy's speech spoke directly to emotion, evoking sensations of recognition and familiarity, even though no listener could explain why. It was as if his language carried within it the emotional DNA of humanity itself, a resonance that connected all people through feeling rather than comprehension. The human mind, shaped by millennia of shared experience, may still carry the echoes of its first languages, the pre-verbal cries, chants, and tonal patterns that once allowed our ancestors to communicate before structured language existed. The boy's strange utterances could have been fragments of this primal expression, something that the conscious mind has forgotten, but the unconscious still remembers. Each syllable was not a word, but a vibration, one that stirred the depths of human instinct. The experience of hearing him became less about listening and more about remembering, awakening something buried beneath layers of civilization. There is a suggestion that his language was an emergence of a forgotten archetype, the voice of humanity before division, before identity, before the barriers of culture separated one tribe from another. His speech had no allegiance to any nation, creed, or ideology. It was not born of any particular tongue, but seemed to belong to the human condition itself. Those who encountered him described how his words created a space where all distinctions dissolved, where every listener felt momentarily unified by a shared sense of origin. In a world increasingly shaped by boundaries and separations, the boy represented something radically whole. His existence whispered that perhaps beneath the diversity of human tongues, there remains a hidden foundation, a single inner language through which all beings are connected. The inability to understand him did not diminish the experience of meaning, it deepened it. For the first time, meaning was not dependent on explanation, but on resonance. His speech worked like music. It was felt, not decoded. And like music, it carried the paradox of being both personal and universal. Every listener heard something unique, yet all were bound by the same emotional thread. This universality hinted at a collective language of the soul, a form of communication unbound by time or culture. The boy seemed to have tapped into that deep, unspoken stream where human emotion and cosmic rhythm merge. Perhaps this is what made his presence so unsettling, the realization that the roots of our consciousness are shared, that the self is not entirely individual, but part of a greater, timeless whole. The scholars of his era could not accept this. To acknowledge it would mean admitting that the mind is not an isolated entity, but a participant in something vast and mysterious. The boy's words tore through the illusion of separateness. He reminded the world that human thought does not begin and end within one lifetime, but is part of an ongoing dialogue across centuries, carried not through speech, but through essence. The collective memory of humanity is not stored in libraries or scriptures. It lives within every mind, waiting for the moment when something, a dream, a vision, or a boy's unknown words, calls it forth. What the boy revealed was not new knowledge, but the ancient truth that humanity is one being with many voices. His language was not forgotten. It had been waiting. It was the sound of unity before division, the echo of a shared soul speaking once more through a child who never learned it, yet somehow always knew. The story of the boy who spoke a language that should not exist is not only the tale of an unsolved mystery, but a reflection of humanity's deep and persistent fear of the unknown self. When people encountered him, they did not simply confront a strange child. They confronted something within themselves that they had long suppressed. Society reacted to him with confusion and terror because his speech symbolized everything that rational civilization seeks to silence: the instincts, the chaos, the imagination, and the darkness of the unconscious. The boy's language became an external mirror of the inner wilderness that most people spend their lives avoiding. Those who tried to define him did not realize that their struggle to understand was in fact a struggle against their own hidden nature. His voice forced them to look inward, to recognize that beneath the orderly structure of reason and morality lies a vast and untamed world of symbols, memories, and desires. The more they tried to explain him, the more he reflected their fear back to them. In every age, humanity has shown a deep anxiety toward what cannot be explained. When something emerges that defies the boundaries of science or faith, it threatens the fragile illusion of control that defines human comfort. The boy's language was one such threat. Scientists sought to categorize it as madness, and priests tried to frame it as demonic possession. Both reactions were attempts to reclaim power over the unknown, to fit the incomprehensible into a framework that made sense. Yet in doing so, they missed the deeper meaning of the event. The boy's speech was not an invasion from beyond, but an eruption from within, a manifestation of the collective unconscious that every human carries. It was not evil, nor was it divine. It was human, profoundly and painfully human. The fear it inspired came from the realization that the boundaries of the self are not as fixed as people believe. Within every person lies the potential for both chaos and creation, order and madness, and this child stood at the threshold between them. The reactions of those around him revealed how unprepared people are to face their own interior depths. Parents who once saw him as innocent began to fear him. Friends who once played with him withdrew. Teachers refused to let him speak in public. They claimed to protect him, but in truth, they were protecting themselves from what he represented. He became a scapegoat for their own discomfort, an embodiment of their collective repression. By labeling him as cursed or ill, they attempted to seal away the disturbing truth that he exposed, that within each person resides a mystery too vast to ever be controlled by reason. His language, incomprehensible as it was, became a symbol of the inner voices that human beings constantly silence in the name of normality. The more society tried to suppress him, the stronger the symbolism became. He stood as the embodiment of what happens when the unconscious speaks, and the conscious world refuses to listen. This confrontation between the known and the unknown self is not confined to one child's story. It is the struggle of all humanity. People build systems, beliefs, and rules to separate themselves from the primal forces within. They fear that acknowledging those forces will destroy their sense of order. Yet those same forces are also the source of creativity, intuition, and transformation. The boy's mysterious words were not random. They carried the rhythm of a truth beyond comprehension, the voice of the inner self crying to be recognized. To reject that voice is to live divided, half awake, half dreaming. Those who heard him and dismissed him as possessed or insane chose safety over awakening. But those few who listened without fear glimpsed something extraordinary, the possibility that the human soul is larger than any definition, that it contains languages and truths beyond the reach of logic. In the end, the boy's tragedy was not that no one understood him, but that no one dared to. Humanity's fear of the unknown self condemned him to isolation, as it so often condemns the visionaries, the dreamers, and the strange. He was silenced not because his words were meaningless, but because they were too meaningful, too close to the hidden truth of what it means to be human. His existence exposed the paradox of mankind's pursuit of understanding. People wish to know themselves, yet fear what they might find. The boy was a reflection of that contradiction, a living reminder that beneath the language of reason sleeps another tongue, ancient and wild, waiting for the courage of the human heart to hear it once more. When the boy's voice finally faded into silence, it was as if the world itself exhaled in relief. The unsettling mystery that had haunted scholars, priests, and witnesses alike had come to an end, yet what lingered was not understanding, but emptiness. His silence became more haunting than his speech ever was, because it carried the echo of something eternal that had momentarily touched the world of the living. Those who had devoted themselves to studying him found that the disappearance of his strange language left a void they could not fill. The words they could not translate had somehow given meaning to their confusion. Now, in their absence, all that remained was the uncomfortable awareness that some mysteries do not exist to be solved. The boy's silence stood as a monument to the limitations of human comprehension. It reminded those who remembered him that there are truths that cannot be captured in words, truths that can only be felt through the experience of encountering the unknown. As time passed, his story transformed from an event into a myth. Scholars continued to debate his origins, linguists searched for parallels, and theologians tried to assign him a place in the cosmic order, but his silence defied all categorization. The more the world tried to define him, the more he withdrew into obscurity, becoming a symbol rather than a subject. This transformation reflected something profound about human nature, the tendency to turn what cannot be understood into myth so that it might be safely admired from a distance. The boy's silence became sacred, not because it offered answers, but because it forced people to accept their ignorance. In his final quiet, he embodied the truth that sometimes understanding must give way to reverence. The world's hunger for explanation met the immovable barrier of mystery, and for a fleeting moment, humanity was humbled by its own limits. The silence also carried a deeper meaning. It represented the return to the original state from which his mysterious words had first emerged, the timeless realm of the unconscious, the place before speech, where experience exists as pure presence. His voice had been a temporary bridge between that inner world and the waking world of thought. When the bridge vanished, the two realms separated once again. Yet something had changed. Those who had heard him were never quite the same afterward. They found themselves dreaming in ways they could not explain, feeling emotions without clear origin, and sensing the nearness of something vast and indefinable. The boy's silence had not erased his influence. It had simply moved it from the outer world into the inner one. His disappearance did not mark an end, but a return, the way the tide withdraws only to remind the shore of the sea's existence. For those who reflected deeply on his story, the boy came to represent the eternal dialogue between the known and the unknowable. His speech was the voice of the mystery, and his silence was its shadow. Together, they formed a complete symbol of human consciousness itself, forever reaching outward for understanding while being rooted in an inner darkness that cannot be spoken. His vanishing from history was therefore not a tragedy, but a lesson. It showed that not all knowledge must be possessed. Some must simply be witnessed. In trying to decipher his language, humanity sought to master the unknown. But what the boy offered was not mastery, it was participation, a reminder that the world of mystery is not meant to be conquered but experienced. His silence was the moment when the infinite reclaimed its secret. Over time, his story became less about the boy himself and more about what he represented. He was no longer seen merely as a child who spoke an impossible language, but as a messenger from the unconscious depths of existence, a figure who appeared to remind humanity of its forgotten connection to the sacred silence that underlies all creation. Every civilization has its myths of beings who speak in voices not of this world, and each of those myths ends not in revelation but in withdrawal. The boy's silence followed the same pattern, the return to the ineffable. It was as though the world had been allowed to hear, for a brief moment, the music beneath all languages, and then it was taken away so that the echo could continue within the hearts of those who had heard it. In that sense, his silence was not an end but a beginning, a return to the eternal rhythm of mystery that lies beneath the surface of all human experience. Through him, the world was reminded that beyond knowledge, beyond reason, and beyond speech, there exists a sacred stillness where truth does not need to be spoken because it has always been known.